Welcome to Fight Back Radio, a production of fightbacknews.org, taking you to the heart of the people's struggles. I'm your host, Richard Berg, and I want to really welcome everybody here to episode 2. We're excited that we've completed our first full episode, and we're ready to launch into this one, and happy to do that. For those of you that didn't hear our first episode with Kobe Guillory, I want to encourage you to go back and check that out. Kobe really laid it down, what's going on in the Black Liberation Movement, and I think if you go back and check it out, you won't regret it. But we have a good guest for you today, which I'm excited to dive into as well. Today we're going to talk about labor history. Here at Fight Back Radio, we believe that all human history is the history of class struggles. And we introduced our first teaser episode on May 1st, International Workers' Day. Today we're going to have the president of the Illinois Labor History Society on our show, Larry Spivack, and he'll talk a little bit about Mayday and about the Haymarket Affair and what led to that, and getting into what of our history is, and some of how there's a struggle over history, and the people who are our enemies often try to write a revisionist history. But the episode today, we'll talk about Pullman, we'll talk about Haymarket, and we'll talk about the importance of history as well. But rather than tell you all about that, why don't we dig into it a little bit? I want to tell you a little bit about Larry Spivack before we take you to the interview, though. Larry is a veteran of the labor movement. He's been around for quite a while. He was started out as an educator for the state of Illinois and was a member of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, Council 31, as an educator. But then he started working for the union. He was an organizer, a staff representative, and eventually became a regional director. He's now the president of the Illinois Labor History Society and has been for some time. Larry describes himself as a citizen historian, and he really is that. And he brings labor history to the people in many, many different ways. And so I think you'll enjoy this episode. So here it is, Larry Spivack. Well, welcome, Larry. Thanks for being here with us for the podcast.
Rich, thanks for letting me be on it.
So let's get right into it. First, looking at labor history, it's a thing that academics do. They look at the history of the working class. Why should, just your average Joe person care one way or another about our history as working people?
Well, it would be easy to get into cliches, for those, of course, who fail to know history are destined to repeat it, and that's a paraphrase of that famous cliche. But as a lifelong activist, as a lifelong labor activist and citizen historian that I guess you could say I've become, I've learned that when people do understand, pay attention to history, it helps guide them in thinking about ways to move forward in the future, ways to conduct themselves, ways to look into more issues that can be significant in the quest for social change, positive social change. So I think it's a bunch of things, and those who go blindly through life and want to talk or discuss or be active in social political arena don't know history. They often just simply have develop what I would say sometimes bad ideas, or just don't have a path to how to feel that anything can change.
Well, on this podcast, I hope to dive in a little bit to some of our labor history. And I wanted to start out with the fact that as president of the Illinois Labor History Society, your organization is the keeper of the Haymarket Monument, where the Haymarket martyrs are buried, just outside of Chicago. And a lot of our listeners probably don't know what the Haymarket Incident is or what that's about. Could you talk a little bit about that?
I can. In fact, remembering Haymarket accurately was really the basis for the formation of our organization in 1969, when our founder, Les O'Rear, and labor educator Bill Edelman, and other people, including Studs Terkel, gathered at across the street from where the actual event took place, or rather the hay wagon where the speakers were mounted and where the police advanced upon, which we'll talk about perhaps in this. That story was something that people felt was inaccurately told, the story of Haymarket. And this resulted in 1969 after the Democratic Convention, and there were a couple efforts to by the weathermen to blow up the police statue that was right near Haymarket Square. And, of course, then there were attacks on the story itself and on a plaque that was on a building commemorating Haymarket, which was stolen. So labor activist educators got together and said, we need something to tell the story, and it would be great if we had a monument here in Haymarket Square.
So the story actually that goes back, am I right, to 1886, right? Way back in the fight for the 8-hour day and some of those things. Is that right?
Well, absolutely. And we, of course, if we had the time, I'd probably give a little more framework to what was led up to 1886, which I can do. But yeah, for those who understand or at least are aware of Haymarket, of which most people incorrectly call it the Haymarket Riot, it was not a riot. You could say it was a police riot, but it was. We often refer to it. We prefer to refer to it as the Haymarket Tragedy or the Haymarket Affair, and it was in the 1884 when the precursor to the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, the organization of the Federation Trades and Labor Unions in Chicago, called for a national strike. That by May 1st of 1886, everybody be on strike for the 8-hour day. And those were,
So let me just stop there. So they were calling for a nationwide general strike, all workers across the country to stop working, to get the 8-hour day, to get no more than 8 hours of work in a single day. It seems awfully ambitious to ask every worker in the whole country to stop working.
I suspect that that ambition is what caused the reaction against the fight for the 8-hour day. And it was relatively successful because from the time that it was called, by May 1st of 1886, 350,000 workers were on strike, 80,000 of them in Chicago, because Chicago really was kind of the center of the developing working class and trade unions in many ways, even though unions were throughout the country. And because, of course, people like Albert Parsons, Lucy Parsons, August Spies, and those who became the martyrs settled in Chicago. And Chicago was the fastest growing city in the world and the fastest growing as the fastest industrialized city in the United States. And so things came together in Chicago. And the events that on May 1st was actually a peaceful demonstration of nearly 80,000 people at Michigan Avenue, led by people including Albert Parsons and Lucy Parsons, marching hand in hand with tens of thousands.
80,000 people marching in Chicago for the 8-hour day on May 1st, 1886.
Right.
Wow. So talk a little more about that, though. You said if you had more time. We have a little time here. About what led up to this. That seems incredible to me. I mean, to get 80,000 people to march in a labor march, even today, with the population of Chicago is so much bigger than it was back then.
Well, as I often, when I talk about history and these stories of events, it's never just there was an event or there was a one day something happened. There's stuff that leads up to it. There's a a timeline, and of course, after the Civil War, there already were 8-hour day movements. There was even legislation, federal legislation, that was never enforced for the 8-hour day. But the fundamental issue of understanding why this is such a big issue is that most workers would be working anywhere from 14 to 16 hours a day to live mostly in poverty or poorly, unemployed, underemployed. And the call for the 8-hour day was a complete radical approach to what would be seen as radical by the business owners, the ruling class, the captains of industry. Because what workers, organized labor, and those who were just in organized labor but were part of the many groups of agitating for a better life, the working class, said that we should only work 8 hours a day, but we should still be paid the same amount, whether it was the 14 or 16 hours we worked and what we got, and not to cut our wages, but to pay us for the full day, but only work 8 hours. So, of course, it's easy to deduce the problem there is you're going to cut into profits, huge cut into profits of the corporate elite. And so that's, of course, why all this culminated in a confrontation, I think it would be fair to say.
So we had, 80,000 people marching for the 8-hour day, and people marching presumably across the country. Maybe not 80,000, but in big numbers, also demanding the 8-hour day. And then, so obviously, you're alluding to that this was a tragedy or whatever. So something happened after May 1st.
Let me just say one other thing as a precursor.
Sure.
In 1877, there was a nationwide strike that spread from West Virginia all the way across the country. And it's probably the closest thing that ever happened is a workers' revolution in the It was a railroad strike, but workers of all different industries started walking out because of this fight over the depressions and boom bust cycles and never having enough, and the greed of the railroad owners, which in that period was the largest industry in the United States in the 1870s. And the culmination of that resulted in the corporate, I say corporate elite, but the 1%, those who owned all industry, to react and realize that there was a movement of workers that could take over if they weren't careful. And so law and order leagues were set up, militias were set up, private militias and National Guard, which is basically to defend the rich against the working class. And this event of 1877 really set the groundwork for this many on the left call it class struggle, which it is, but it was really set up the idea that there's an us and a them, that maybe as business owners, we need more defense of our industry by the U.S. Army, the military, the military-industrial complex, if you will. And labor and agitators and activists and of all sorts saw this as an attack on rightful quest for a better life.
So you're painting a picture of polarization in the decade or a little more leading up to the Haymarket tragedy or affair, and so on the labor side, we have this, movement. We need, major cut in hours of work with the same amount of pay. I mean, you're talking about a third or more less work to do in a day, and getting the same wages was what the demand was. A big strike in Chicago and across the country, and you're giving us hints that there was a reaction that the bosses just didn't, and the government just didn't say, "Oh, okay, 8-hour day, we'll accept that. We'll just have to get by with a little less profit these days." So,
interestingly enough, even though it wasn't even May 1st, because so many workers were already on strike throughout the country, but especially in Chicago, 10,000 workers before May 1st won the 8-hour day from the many protests and marches that were being held. And there are maps of the numerous that show the marches of where workers were protesting and marching for the 8-hour day. So the 8-hour day was coming to a small degree, but ultimately with 350,000 people on strike, business is a little bit concerned. And so after the rally of May 1st, on May 3rd, there was an attack on workers where on the southwest side of Chicago, just a little bit southwest, if you know Chicago, near Blue Island and Western, where the McCormick Reaper plant was. And the police came during a lockout of the workers, and during a shift change, started firing upon workers and that were on the picket line, and 2 workers were shot dead. And this was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back, because those who were in Chicago, led by a call for action among disparate groups of workers, but people like August Spies, who ultimately becomes one of the Haymarket martyrs, along with Albert Parsons and a few others. There were, of course, we call 8 of them the martyrs, even though only 4 were hanged at the end of this confrontation, and 1 died in prison. The call for a protest at what we call Haymarket Square on the near west side of Chicago for the next day, the next evening. And the call was made. The hope was that 20,000 workers would come to protest the brutality against the workers from the police, and it was a call for the right to organize under the Bill of Rights, the right to freely assemble, the right of free speech, the right to protest. And every time workers were on strike, they were getting shot and killed. And it's not really an exaggeration to say every time. It was very often in any event. And the call that, you're talking about 1886, it's pretty hard to communicate in one evening to get 20,000 people out on the streets. And May 4th...
No Apple computers back in
That's
those
correct. And no cell phones. It's amazing that 2,500 people showed up for this very poorly organized rally. And given the short time, they didn't even have all the speakers. Albert Parsons, who was the first speaker, didn't even know about the event till an hour and a half before the event, or some period very right before it. He had just come back from Cincinnati, from organizing in Cincinnati on May 2nd. And so it was a bad evening weather-wise. 2,500 people show up, and they all scrunch towards these hay wagons where the speakers mounted in order to speak to the crowd, the smaller crowd. And of course, across the street from them was Inspector Bonfield, who kind of for corporate America led the police, even though he wasn't the chief of police. Corporate America didn't trust the mayor, Mayor Harrison, because he was pretty friendly with the working class and labor, and had liberal views in that regard. The police were 176 in number, carrying Winchester repeater rifles. The story accurately told, because of so many witnesses and the ultimate trial and everything else that brought everything in evidence, was that at around 10 o'clock, the mayor told, 10 o'clock in the evening, told Inspector Bonfield to send his men home. The rally was peaceful. And it was just, strong political speeches by a number of people. And the last speaker, Samuel Fielden, who was actually a lay preacher and also a teamster, had a wagon for hire. He was the last speaker. And when the mayor left and he was still talking, the police advanced on to the crowd that was down to 250 people. And the inspector says, "I command you in the name of the people to disperse." And Samuel Fielden says, "But this is a peaceable meeting." And at that moment, a bomb, and people witnessed the lit fuse, was tossed from behind a vestibule that was, you couldn't see who was behind there. And the bomb landed at the foot of the flank of police, and it exploded, and one policeman died instantly. And ultimately, in the chaos of the street lamp being blown out, the panic, and the only people armed, and there is no evidence in this case that any workers were armed or workers ever shot anybody, which is why the fallacy of it being a riot and all the illustrations showing workers shooting at the police is just simply false. The police fired into the crowd and killed 6 of their own. And so it was...
So how did they kill 6 policemen if...
Well, because it was dark and it was panic. And, people, once the bomb went off, everybody freaked out, as we would say in today's parlance. And it was just friendly fire.
Did any of the people that were at the rally, did any of them get hurt?
There's reason to believe that somewhere between 5 and 12 workers died, but because of the fear and the panic, martial law was declared, and people knew if they went to a hospital with injuries, they might be rounded up as part of this.
So people were afraid, even if they were shot by the police, to go to the hospital
Absolutely.
to get treatment for it.
So there's reason to believe somewhere between 5 and 12 workers actually died. Certainly more were injured. But that was the event. That was the real question is, why was a bomb thrown at that point in time? What purpose did it serve? And, from a perspective of labor history, many of us think that it could very well have been the pretext by corporate America to declare war on the working class, on this fight for the 8-hour day. And while it fits into a neat story, there's nobody knows who actually threw the bomb. You can speculate on so many possibilities. It wasn't any of the people who were brought to trial. Originally, 12 men were actually indicted, but then I can't remember if 12 were indicted, but ultimately they pared it down to 8 people. And they were random. They were activists. They were picked out because they were leaders. In fact, I'll just cut to the chase. There was this trial that happened. This was, of course, May 4th, the tragedy. By the middle of June, I'm thinking it was around June 21st, the trial starts, where a grand jury indicts them on flimsy and no evidence for all practical purposes. A lot of evidence that was paid for, that was false. Later that comes out in the investigations afterwards, that they were trumped up charges. It was a political conspiracy to bring down this movement. And the men are found guilty very quickly by an unfair jury, which is why ultimately future governor of Illinois, Governor John Peter Altgeld, pardons them, because the trial was unfair, very simply by the selection of the jury, which basically people were put on the jury who said they couldn't be fair. The judge just said, you're on the jury. And this is all in the transcripts of the voir dire of the leading up to the trial.
So this whole incident later led to what became the Mayday around the world, International Workers' Day. But let me go back to these 8 guys that were arrested. Who were they? Why did they pick them instead of 8 other people?
Well, there's I think in the summation, the prosecution said, these men are no more guilty than the rest of you, and talking to the jury and to the crowd, but convict them for their ideas to keep our society safe. Because there was ultimately no evidence that they did anything. So it became a war of, it became an attack on the idea against labor, against the 8-hour day, against free speech that conducted by those who are on the side of the working class. And Albert Parsons is one of the leaders of the workers' movement in Chicago and in the country, well known, hated by the wealthy. August Spies was a editor of the German language newspaper Arbeiter Zeitung, and was part and parcel of the movement of workers' rights. And a couple other people were active as anarchists, anarcho-syndicalists, socialists. They all participated in a very progressive wing of politics against the ruling class. And so they were seen as influencers, the 8 of them. Interestingly enough, most of them weren't even there when the bomb was thrown, which is what makes this such a, silly isn't the word, but unconscionable that they were selected as people to be on trial. Again, that goes to pick out people who you can show the rest of the world who are leaders, that keep them from spreading their ideas to keep our society safe. They were mostly immigrants from Germany, and Chicago was 1/3 German-speaking at that time. And there were a lot of German immigrants that had come here, came with advanced political ideas, and so there was part of that. There was a hatred towards Germans in Chicago, especially. who were many had a progressive view of politics. The only American-born was Albert Parsons, who was actually, ironically, was from the South and was a lieutenant in the Confederacy. But he quickly, right after the Civil War, gave that up, and he actually married an African-American woman, Lucy Gonzalez Parsons, and lived in Texas, which is amazing to think about in 1870s. And they came to Chicago. So he was the only American-born. Samuel Fielden was born in Lancashire, England, and the others came from Germany. Louis Ling, who was the one was slated to be hanged, died in prison, probably murdered by the police the night before, was born in Switzerland, but he was a German national.
So let's talk a little bit about the aftermath of this. I mentioned just recently that this was the beginning of Mayday. Some people will say 1886 was the first Mayday.
Well,
how did that come to be, or is that true?
Well, I don't think we would say 1886 was the first Mayday, because in 1889, the Second International convening in Paris of an international congress of socialists got together, and with representatives from Chicago, put forward a resolution that, in honor of the Haymarket martyrs, who were judicially murdered, were to be honored by International Labor Day, to start on May 1st of 1890, and that's when May Day becomes official, May 1st, 1890, because of this Congress in Paris in 1889. And it became very popular all around the world as International Labor Day. And there was a struggle in the United States because some people wanted to celebrate May 1st, but there had already been calls for a Labor Day for years. And ultimately in 1894, after the Pullman Strike, President Grover Cleveland signed legislation passed that year to appease, to some degree, the idea that there should be a Labor Day, and it becomes the official Labor Day in America. But May Day persists as a holiday, or at least as a celebration and parades, well into the 1930s, and after that became even less recognized and somewhat forgotten.
Let me ask you about Lucy Parsons. You mentioned her. So this is the widow of the main English-speaking speaker of the labor movement, probably at that time, Albert Parsons. And you mentioned she was black, a former slave, and they moved from Texas to Chicago. Can you talk a little bit about who she is, and also about the role she played in keeping the story of Haymarket and with the martyrs, what they died for, and the importance of the struggle of working people alive?
So I know that the audience I'm talking to is probably more politically aware about history than a lot of audiences, general audiences, whether in the United States or around the world would be. But still, people don't really know this part of history very well. Lucy Parsons, I would argue, would be one of the most important people in American history. And who knows who Lucy Parsons is? Well, partly because we erase history to keep people from having power and understanding where power comes from. And Lucy represented that. Lucy was a dynamic woman on her own. She was an organizer. She organized sewing workers and all kinds of people. And after the hanging of the martyrs in 1887, and then, of course, one dies in prison, 3 go to jail. 2 of them had their sentences commuted to life in prison. 1 got 15 years. Lucy wanted to remember the events, to help the world remember the events, and she created an organization called the Pioneer Aid Support Association. But what really got this thing of memory alive, and that association was to support the widows and families of those who were imprisoned, was that the corporate elite decided to create a statue to honor the police, which still stands over at police headquarters in Chicago and has an incorrect saying etched into it about who caused this event. But Lucy was horrified that this was the statue, and so she decided that there should be a statue for the martyrs. And a plot of land was purchased at the Forest Home Cemetery. Back then it was called German Waldheim Cemetery. Today Forest Home in Forest Park, about 9 miles west of the Loop, downtown Chicago. And eventually a beautiful monument was constructed, and it's where the men had already been buried in 1887. Then this monument was laid over the ground in 1893. And the day after the monument was unveiled, Governor Altgeld actually pardoned those for being in prison, and ultimately we just call all of them the Haymarket Martyrs. But Lucy Parsons kept the story alive through the Pioneer Aid Support Association, organized, and she was prohibited from speaking, banned from speaking in Chicago because she was radical. She was her views were well known, and yet she would still organize. She would actually she would get on a barge on the Chicago River and give talks to workers who were working on the river, because lots of industry was right along the Chicago River at that time. And waterway was federal, was not governed by Chicago. It was by federal law as a waterway. So she was not prohibited from speaking from the water as opposed to being on land. So she was dynamic. She was at the founding of the 1905 convention, the founding of the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. She was an avowed anarchist, but ultimately her views changed over time. And after World War I believe, she began to associate with the American Communist Party and sympathized that way. And the idea of anarchism became less. She died in a house fire, a tragic house fire in 1942. But up to the very day before she died, she was an activist. By the way, it's suspicious how the house caught on fire, because just before that, the police had basically raided the house and took much of the books and writings that had already existed. Lucy is a woman that deserves to be known in American history. As much as we talk about the lack of women being recognized, Lucy is right up there with the best of them.
Well, thank you for bringing her to our attention, and hopefully sparked some of our listeners to go out and find out more about her. Her founding of the Pioneer Aid Society sounds like she may have been the first president of the Illinois Labor History Society.
Well, yeah, well, in a way you can say that. And let me say a little bit about our history, because I started talking about we were formed in 1969 to remember the Haymarket. But in 1971, the last surviving member of the Pioneer Aid Support Association, he was a lawyer, Irving Abrams. He was Lucy Parsons' lawyer. He deeded the Haymarket Martyrs Monument in Forest Park to the new Illinois Labor History Society. And what that means is that we are the steward. We own the monument. I think it's fair to say the most sacred labor site in the entire world. I don't think that could even be questioned, even though people who love labor history will talk about certain events. But this is the event that helped spur on political activism, revolutions around the world, the Haymarket Martyrs and the creation of Mayday. So we're very proud that this is something that we have this awesome, huge responsibility to maintain, to keep track of, to share with the world. And there's a lot about why people who come to Chicago want to come see the Martyrs. And I live near there, and I can I'll stop by, and I'll often see people from all over the world, if not the country, who just taken a trip, heard about this is where the Martyrs are laid to rest. It's a beautiful monument, and that's our mission, to tell the story.
And May 1st every year, the Illinois Labor History Society, the Chicago Federation of Labor, and activists from many movements gather at Haymarket. I know I've been there myself. Could you talk a little bit about that, Larry?
Well, the monument in Haymarket Square, and I know it gets confusing to talk about the Martyrs Monument in Forest Park where they're laid to rest, but there is nothing that existed on the space where the Haymarket tragedy took place until after Harold Washington was mayor in 1983. And there was a plaque put on the ground at the spot where the hay wagon was, where the speakers spoke from. And while the ILHS had been pushing the city for some kind of monument, it finally happened and was dedicated in 2004. It's public art. It's a sculpture, a statue, a memorial, a monument at the site of Haymarket, on Haymarket Square. And in 2004, there was the unveiling, and we decided, I was active in the ILHS at that point and became president the year after, in 2006 actually. We discussed why not have plaques from labor federations all around the world celebrate May Day, where the events took place every year, and have plaques from labor federations mounted on the base of the monument. And the city was in agreement, even though it's a city, I guess you'd say it's public art, but the city is in control of it. And in 2005, Labor Federation from Colombia came and presented the first plaque. And since 2005, every year we have a gathering on May 1st. And we've had some pretty good crowds for events like this. And a plaque is dedicated. I start talking about countries that have already been here to dedicate plaques on May 1st. And I won't name all of them, but it includes Germany, France, Sweden, Iraq, Mexico, Ireland, New Zealand. This year, 18 years later, 17, I can't do the math. We have the Federation of Metallurgical and Office Workers Union of Italy coming to dedicate a plaque. It's one of the older, larger unions in Italy, and they're going to be here to dedicate a plaque. Last year, we had the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists. And so these plaques are now filling up the base of this monument, and it's a great event. And the Chicago Federation of Labor has been a co-sponsor when we asked them, which is something that I was very excited about, because many people will criticize American labor as being too conservative, and this story of labor history isn't told. And a lot of that is true. But the Chicago Federation of Labor, surprisingly to a lot of people, has actually a rich history of progressivism. And with the leaders back of the CFL in 2005 agreed we should be co-sponsors of this important event. So together we put on this rally for May Day, and it's coming up.
Yeah, no, it's an exciting event every May 1st. I know I was involved one year in helping to get the KMU from the Philippines to put their plaque on. And interestingly enough, the name of their union, this is a Filipino union, federation, is KMU. It translates to May 1st movement, and so that they took the name of their labor federation from the incidents that happened in Chicago back in 1886 and the subsequent movement that came out of that. And
I would be remiss if I didn't mention that you were instrumental in helping us get the plaque from the World Federation of Trade Unions.
Oh, yes, I remember that one as well. Those were both exciting events, and I look forward to it again this year. Let me change gears a little bit here. Another thing besides the Haymarket history, that a decade after that, there was a strike against George Pullman and the Pullman Corporation, just in Chicago now, but it was at that time, I'm not sure if it was part of the city or just outside of it, but could you talk a little bit about the Pullman Strike and Eugene V. Debs and your organization's role in trying to keep this memory alive?
So the Pullman Strike is in itself, the story of Pullman, not just the strike, is the story of America. I often say that. And talking about today, now Pullman is being preserved, not just as the company town that it was, but the old factory building that's being restored, and there's now a national park. In 2014, President Obama signed an executive order making Pullman a national monument, which is essentially a national park. And it's finally getting funding, and it's advancing beautifully as a place to come. We've been holding Labor Day rallies, the other Labor Day, the one in September, the first Monday in September, which comes from the events at Pullman. Every year we've been part and parcel of a Labor Day celebration there. But the Pullman event, the Pullman Strike, happens because even though the events of Haymarket created a backlash, fear among labor to organize because of all the violence that could happen against workers, once again, America was in 1893 in a depression. This is regular and periodic as part of the kind of capitalist system that we live in. And the workers in Pullman that worked in the factory building the railroad cars that carried people around the world on railroads in beautiful luxury, the Pullman Palace car, the workers who had their wages cut 25 to 50%. They didn't cut management's wages. And George Pullman was a well-known, one of the billionaires of the era, would have been one of the richest men in the world of all time, and was just so hostile to even talking to the representatives of the workers about doing something about this attack on them by cutting their wages when they had to pay their rent to George Pullman. It was a company town. They didn't get paid in scrip but they did like coal miners did. But basically, they had to give everything back to Pullman and could barely make it, even though the housing stock was nicer than where a lot of workers lived in the city. Pullman, up until 1892, wasn't part of Chicago, but it was annexed by Chicago in 1892. And ultimately, it's another story of a woman who plays a key role in American history that virtually no one would know. And her name was Jenny Curtis. And when Pullman refused to talk to the workers, Jenny Curtis went along with the Reverend Cowardine, who was a Methodist minister in Chicago, to speak to the American Railway Workers Union that was having a convention led by Eugene Debs. And Jenny Curtis's speech, an 18-year-old young woman, literally caused the 600 or so members of the delegation to vote to support the strike. And ultimately, it was decided by the American Railway Workers Union to strike all railroad cars, all railroads that would carry a Pullman car across the nation. And in the end, it didn't, in that point in time, it didn't end well for the union and the leaders like Eugene Debs, because by supporting the strike, it went against federal law, because after that happened, the railroads got the U.S. government to say that mail delivery cars would be attached to Pullman cars, and then you'd be striking the U.S. government, and you can't do that. So they were all thrown in prison, for all the leaders, and the strike collapsed. But what the strike did do is it produced a number of ideas to think about for workers. One was that instead of organizing on a craft basis, that factories, even Pullman, they had dozens of unions. A factory could have 5, 10, 15 different unions based on the specific job title. And the Pullman strike helped build this idea that maybe we should organize by sector, organize by industry. All railroad workers should be in a union. All steel workers should be in a union. This came a few years later, 10 years later, the industrial workers of the world said there should just be one union for all workers. So, but this strike pushed the idea as getting a Labor Day. It pushed the idea of industrial unionizing, and it radicalized people like Eugene Debs to become a great social political activist, as opposed to just a union leader of his one union.
Yeah. So we see a little bit here how both you mentioned earlier the strike of 1877 in the rails, and then this one in 1890, where the federal government, in the case of 1877, I think it was after Reconstruction, troops coming up to suppress the strike, and then 1890 through using the mail cars, again, the federal government suppressing the strike. That led people like Debs, I think, tell me if I'm wrong here, to become more political and whatever. He was leader of the Socialist Party for decades after the Pullman strike.
Right, and he wouldn't have called himself a socialist at the time of the strike, but he evolved because he was a brilliant man, charismatic, a great speaker, a great writer, and he was, of course, sent to prison in Woodstock, Illinois, about 50 miles northwest of the city, because if he had been imprisoned at Cook County Jail, the workers would have broken him out. He was that popular. And when he got out, he gave his famous Liberty speech, and then ultimately started running for president. He even received 1 million votes almost twice, once as a convict after he opposed World War I in 1919. He ran his convict number. A button would have convict number and then a picture of him. And he was quite popular running on the Socialist Party ticket among millions of people. But, the other part of the Pullman story, which is, again, the story of America, is also the story of the building of the first African-American trade union, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. Because after unions started getting recognition in Pullman, even this is before collective bargaining, black workers weren't allowed into the white union. And so the porters, who are the men, started out as ex-slaves who were hired by Pullman to be of service, because that was the only kind of person that Pullman would hire to do that kind of work, to be subservient and to not even be allowed to use their own name. They used his name, George, 10,000 Men Named George, which is a documentary, by the way. The inhumanity of it, and then couldn't be in the white union, ultimately hired an organizer, A. Philip Randolph, who came out of the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s. From 1925 until they got their first contract in 1937, which created a black middle class, A. Philip Randolph became one of the working class leaders of this country. And there's one other part of this story. This goes to the idea of how little people understand American history, labor history in particular, or even know it or taught it. We think about people like Martin Luther King and the end of Jim Crow and all that. It really goes back to labor organizing and what Martin Luther King saw his mentor, A. Philip Randolph, talking about boycotts. These are a lot of stories about A. Philip Randolph, because in World War II, A. Philip Randolph was calling for a march on Washington to end desegregation of the defense industry. And Franklin Roosevelt had to concede. And a young Martin Luther King sees all of this, sees how labor sit-downs, the work of A. Philip Randolph. Ultimately, A. Philip Randolph is one of the creators of the 1963 March on Washington, the I Have a Dream March. Everybody says, well, it's Martin Luther King. A. Philip Randolph is behind that. And so it's the story of labor history. Civil rights is interconnected in so many ways.
Yeah, even Dr. King, when he died, he was supporting your old union, AFSCME, in Memphis at the sanitation workers strike there.
When I give talks and I'll say, does anybody know where Martin Luther King was when he died? Most people, the general public for sure, labor people in my union, although in AFSCME, people now generally know this. It's part and parcel of just being part of AFSCME, but not exclusively. You'll say, do you know where he was? Some people say, yeah, I think it was in Memphis. Why was he there? Because civil rights. Well, it was about the AFSCME strike. I Am a Man strike that the 2,500 sanitation workers weren't recognized by the city and were paid terrible wages in the very, very dangerous job. And 2 workers had died, were crushed by the mechanism of the garbage truck. And so this coalition of civil rights and labor activism are in many ways one and the same.
So, we could talk about many more labor. It's labor history events, but we're winding down here a little bit. And I'm curious, as a student of labor history and somebody who looks at it so closely, how do you look at our labor movement today? How do you see where we're at relative to those days? And what things are you looking for in labor? And any advice you got for any of our listeners?
Let me start with advice.
Okay.
The advice is to learn labor history. And this is a weakness of unions, organized labor, in that it's not taught. Once in a while, some workers will go to a program where there might be labor history. This is something that I've been doing for a long time. And when I see union activists and workers learn about their history, they become excited, said, how come nobody ever told me this? How come I don't know this? How could I not know this? If this is such a big deal, if the May Day is celebrated by billions of people around the world, how come we didn't know it had to do with the Haymarket Affair? And so you could go on and on about that. But mostly it's about, as we learn this, it helps give us a sense of hope. Even though most of the stories are about tragedy and violence, well, that's part and parcel of the struggle. And when people see, though, that, when we got the end of child labor, when we got better wages, when we started getting pensions, and we got the 35 things that workers take for granted, from Social Security to Fair Labor Standards Act and Family Medical Leave Act, you could go on and on and on about all these things, vacations, holidays. It's because of the struggle of workers who organized to make social change. And that's what I want people to do, is learn those things and see where it came from. And you will then organically feel inspired to participate, because it's ultimately about participation. This is a big question, what you ask about what do I think about labor today and what we should do. It's always about organize, organize, organize. And it's been difficult because, as we all know, those who are versed in it know that only about 6% of the private sector is even in a union right now. And the only reason it's close to 12% is because the public sector is a little over 35% organized. But I think it's become clear, especially the last few years, as the wealth and wage inequality, wealth inequality grows and grows and grows. We all know that, workers really haven't had a wage increase in 40 years if you incorporate inflation into it. Wages are actually less for most working people. But there have been a lot of successes in organizing, and more, if we talk about today, suddenly we're seeing, Starbucks workers organizing. There's been the fight for 15. The idea of a $15 an hour minimum wage has been around for about 10 years at least. But now, you go on Facebook and it says Amazon hiring minimum $15 an hour, $18 an hour. This is all because of these movements and this consciousness that's continuing to develop. So I think we're in a really interesting period, and we can criticize organized labor all we want, and it's easy to do because there are a lot of mistakes made. I would say a lack of seeing the future is because we don't know the past. But unions are made up of, like every institution, regular people, and they're political organizations. And there's so many factors, but there is definitely a developing awareness, consciousness, and movement towards action and organizing. When you see that the Amazon workers didn't win the election last year in Bessemer, Alabama, it's not because there wasn't a desire. It's because the ability of government and corporations to attack workers. That's why the workers didn't win that election. That's why the UAW didn't win the election in Tennessee a couple of years ago I can't remember if it was Toyota, Nissan, one of those two companies, or Volkswagen for that matter. It's because, the conspiracy of corporate America owning the government basically is able to keep American workers from being able to have a voice. And, we don't see this same attack on workers at the same level because across the rest of the developed world, labor laws actually exist to defend workers. In America, the labor laws are designed to keep workers from advancing. So it's a combination of these things. And it's always about, legislation is important. Organizing is important. Collective bargaining is important. And there is the highest level of support for unions now exists in America since the 1960s. So it's possible. And if we can tell this story, these stories of all the heroes that we don't know about and what they have done, heroes collectively and individually, we make the social change, because that's how social change always takes place.
So that's a good note to end on. And so thank you, Larry Spivack, President of the Illinois Labor History Society, for being with us today. And thank you for being here.
And thank you.
I hope you enjoyed that. Here at Fight Back Radio, we believe that people need to know their own history, and working class history is often buried or hard to find. So we encourage you to go look more about Pullman or Haymarket or any other parts of our history, because it's important for us to know. It's an inspiration for us to move on and to continue to the class struggle to fight for justice. And so we hope you'll do that. If you want to look to the Illinois Labor History Society for some resources, you can go to their website, which I strongly encourage. It's illinoislaborhistory.org. They also have a Facebook page that they update on a regular basis, so it's the Illinois Labor History Society webpage. And then also just, our own website, fightbacknews.org, brings you news and views of the people's struggles. And so I encourage you to go there and check that out. Please also, consider giving us 5 stars, writing a positive review, subscribing, and telling your friends about us. We're still in the promotion stage. This is only our 2nd episode, so we want to get the word out that we have this podcast. And if you could pass the word, that's probably our best thing. We don't have millions or billions of dollars to run advertising, so we're counting on our listeners to tell other people to create more listeners. If you want to talk to us, or you want to reach out to me and tell me how to make this podcast better, or recommend guests, or anything else, you can reach me at richard.fightbackradio@gmail.com. That's richard.fightbackradio@gmail.com. And then finally, I want to thank again our production team of Vince Olson and Shane Tremley. And thank you so much. I mean, making this sound good and getting all the sound equipment together, it's really made the difference for us. So thank you, Shane. Thank you, Vince. And then finally, on behalf of the entire Fight Back Radio team, I'm Richard Berg saying until next time, all power to the people.